My mom called me at 6:17 on a Tuesday morning. Nobody calls at 6:17 unless somebody died. So when I saw her name on my phone, my stomach dropped. I answered immediately. Mom. Silence, then a shaky breath. Honey. That was enough. I sat upright in bed. What happened? Another pause, and then she said 6 words that made absolutely no sense. We might lose the house. I blinked. What? The house? I looked over at my husband. Ryan was still asleep beside me, or at least he had been. Now he was watching me, concern already written across his face. Mom, what are you talking about? She started crying, actually crying. Not the dramatic kind, not the guilt trip kind. Real crying, the kind you hear when someone's world is falling apart. And suddenly I wasn't tired anymore. I was wide awake, because in 34 years, I'd heard my mother cry maybe 3 times. This was number 4. 3 hours later, I was driving to my parents' house, the same house where I grew up, the same house where my younger sister Emily had spent 29 years being treated like she was God's personal favorite. If you have siblings, you probably know what I'm talking about. There's always one kid who somehow gets away with murder. Emily wasn't literally that bad, but close. Close enough. Growing up, Emily never heard the word no. I practically got it engraved into my soul. Emily wanted a horse. She got one. I wanted a used Honda when I turned 16. Dad handed me applications for part-time jobs. Emily wanted to go to a private college. Mom and Dad took out loans. I got scholarships. 3 of them. And still worked nights. Emily quit jobs. Started businesses. Quit those too. Started new ones. Every failure somehow became someone else's responsibility. Usually my parents, sometimes mine. And somehow everybody acted like that was normal. For years I told myself I didn't care. I had my own life. A good life. I worked hard. Built a career. Bought a home. Married a great guy. What was the point of being bitter? Then I'd watch my parents write another check for Emily, and suddenly bitterness felt pretty reasonable. When I pulled into their driveway, 3 vehicles were already there. My father's truck, my mother's SUV, Emily's Mercedes, of course. I laughed out loud, a bitter little laugh, because somehow I already knew, whatever disaster was happening, Emily was standing in the middle of it. Again. Mom opened the door before I knocked. She looked awful. Red eyes. Pale face. Messy hair. Dad wasn't much better. Neither was Emily. Actually. Scratched that, Emily looked worse. Much worse. Mascara streaked. Face swollen from crying. Hands shaking. For a split second, I felt bad for her. Then I remembered the last 15 years. The feeling passed, fast. What happened? I asked. Nobody answered immediately. Great. One of those meetings. I hated those. The kind where everybody sits around looking miserable while nobody wants to be the first person to say the terrible thing out loud. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. It's complicated. I nearly rolled my eyes. Then uncomplicated. Mom started crying again. Dad stared at the table, and Emily looked down. That was when I knew. Whatever this was.id was bad, really bad. Dad slid a folder across the kitchen table. My pulse immediately sped up. Folders are never good news. I opened it. Mortgage statements, bank records, legal notices, payment demands, property documents. My confusion lasted about 20 seconds. Then it disappeared. And pure disbelief took its place. I looked up, then back down. Then up again. Nobody spoke. No, Dad closed his eyes. I stared at Emily. She couldn't even look at me. My heart started pounding. Tell me I'm reading this wrong. Silence. Tell me. Nothing. And suddenly I understood. Every awful piece, every missing puzzle piece, every strange conversation over the past year, every weird phone call, every tense family gathering. Everything. The house wasn't in danger because of my parents. The house was in danger because of Emily. 5 years earlier, Emily had started a lifestyle company. A tea lease that was the official story. In reality, it was an Instagram account with expensive branding. She sold planners, journals, online courses, motivational nonsense, the kind of stuff that sounds impressive until you ask basic questions, like revenue, or profit, or taxes. Emily called herself an entrepreneur. Most entrepreneurs I know actually make money, but somehow her business survived, year after year, even though nobody could explain how. Now I finally knew why. Mom and Dad had been funding it the entire time. Not small amounts, huge amounts. Amounts that made me feel physically sick. Over $400,000. I read the number 3 times. 4. Then 5. Still couldn't believe it. 400 grand. My voice cracked. Dad looked away. Mom started crying harder. Emily stared at the floor. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because my brain literally didn't know what else to do. $400,000. For planners and inspirational quotes. Jesus Christ. Then came the worst part. The part that made my blood run cold. The collateral agreement. I stared at it. Read it twice. Then a third time. No, my voice sounded different now. Sharper. Dangerous. Dad swallowed. I looked directly at him. You used the house? Nobody answered. I slammed the document onto the table. You used the house? Mom flinched. Dad nodded. Once. Small. Ashamed. And suddenly I couldn't sit still anymore. I stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. You mortgaged the house? Honey, no, I pointed at the paperwork. You put your house up as collateral for Emily's business? The silence answered for them. And that silence made me furious, because this wasn't some accident. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a medical emergency. This wasn't life happening. This was choice after choice after choice. Years of choices, terrible ones. And now the bill had arrived. I looked at Emily. Finally, really looked at her. What happened? She burst into tears. Again. I lost a client. A client. One client. I laughed so hard it hurt. A client? It was my biggest account. Oh, good. I threw my hands up. That makes it way better. Dad shot me a warning look. I ignored it. 34 years of patience was running dangerously low. How much money did you lose? Emily whispered a number. I thought I'd misheard. How much? She repeated it, and suddenly the room started spinning. Because it wasn't thousands. It wasn't even hundreds of thousands. It was millions. And for the first time all morning, I realized this situation was even worse than I thought. Much worse. Because losing the house wasn't the real problem. It was just the first one. And I had a feeling the next revelation was going to be a lot uglier. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. I just stood there, staring at Emily, staring at my parents, waiting for someone to tell me I'd misunderstood. Nobody did. Because I hadn't. The number Emily had whispered wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. Over $2 million. Gone. Just gone. I sat back down slowly. Not because I was calm. Because my legs suddenly felt weak. Ryan always says there are numbers that stop feeling real. $2 million was one of them. What exactly did you do? I asked. Emily wiped her eyes. It wasn't supposed to happen. I laughed. A sharp, ugly laugh. That's your explanation? I'm serious. Fantastic. So am I. Dad rubbed his forehead. Let her explain. I looked at him. Why? Nobody stopped her before. That landed hard. Dad looked away. Mom cried harder. Emily's face turned red. Good. For once, somebody besides me could be uncomfortable. Apparently, Emily's company wasn't really a company anymore. At least not a successful one. For the last 2 years, she'd been bleeding money. Advertising, consultants, marketing agencies, office space she didn't need, employees she couldn't afford. Everything was financed through loans. More loans. And then more loans. Every time she got into trouble, she borrowed more money to hide the trouble. Which sounds insane. Because it is. But she'd be surprised how long people can keep digging if nobody takes away the shovel. My parents never took away the shovel. They bought her a bigger one. The deeper I dug into the paperwork, the worse it got. There were personal guarantees, private lenders, interest rates that should probably be illegal. At one point I actually stopped reading, not because I was finished, because I physically needed a minute. My head hurt. My chest hurt. Everything hurt. You knew this was happening? I looked directly at my parents. Mom answered first. We were helping. Helping. That word. That stupid word. People use it to justify everything. Helping. Enabling. Protecting. Rescuing. Different labels. Same behavior. You weren't helping. My voice came out flat. You were financing a disaster. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. Then I found something else. A separate folder. Smaller. Thinner. Somehow worse. I opened it. Immediately regretted it. What is this? Emily looked sick. Dad looked defeated. Mom started crying before anybody answered. That was never a good sign. Then Emily finally spoke. The IRS. My stomach dropped. Oh. You've got to be kidding me. Nobody laughed. Because nobody was kidding. I spent the next 20 minutes reading documents that felt like they belonged to somebody else's life. Unpaid taxes, penalties, audits, missed filings, warnings, final notices. The kind of paperwork that arrives after years of ignoring reality. I looked at Emily. You didn't pay taxes? I couldn't. Couldn't? She nodded. I needed the money. I honestly didn't know whether to scream or laugh. Maybe both. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, counting to 10. Then 20. Then 30. Because if I spoke too soon, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. Finally, I looked at my parents. The question had been building in my head for hours. Now I couldn't ignore it anymore. How long? Mom blinked. What? How long have you known? The room went silent. Dad answered. A while. A while. Silence. Define a while. Nobody moved. Then Dad quietly said. 3 years. 3 years. 3 years. The room suddenly felt very small. I couldn't breathe. 3 years. For 3 years they knew the business was collapsing. For 3 years they knew the debt was growing. For 3 years they knew the house was at risk, and somehow nobody thought maybe I should know? Maybe the accountant in the family should know? Maybe the financially responsible daughter should know? Apparently not. I stood up again. This time nobody tried stopping me. Do you know what the craziest part is? Nobody answered. I actually could have helped. The words came out sharper than intended. Because they were true. I could have helped. Not with everything. Not with $2 million, but with reality. With planning. With damage control. With literally anything. Instead, they'd hidden everything. Again, just like always, Emily made mistakes. Everybody protected Emily. Everybody lied for Emily. Everybody cleaned up after Emily. Until eventually there was nothing left to clean. Then Emily surprised me. For the first time all day. For the first time in years, honestly, she stood up, looked directly at me, and said, "You're right." I blinked. What? You're right. The room went silent. Even Mom stopped crying. Emily laughed bitterly. I always knew they'd save me. Nobody spoke. I never even questioned it. Her voice cracked every time something went wrong. Somebody fixed it. She looked at Dad, then Mom, then me. I got used to it. The honesty caught me off guard. Because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't manipulative. It was ugly and real. Tears rolled down her face. I thought I was successful. Nobody interrupted. I thought I was building something. Another pause. I wasn't. The words seemed painful for her to say. Good. Truth usually is. I was building debt. She laughed. Then immediately started crying again. The sound broke something inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But anger started making room for something else. Sadness. Because suddenly Emily didn't look like the golden child. She looked like a scared little girl. A 30-year-old scared little girl. But still scared. Still lost. Still desperately waiting for somebody else to save her. And that's when I realized the real tragedy. The favoritism hadn't only hurt me. It had hurt her too. Just differently. I learned independence because nobody rescued me. Emily never learned independence because everybody did. Neither outcome was fair. Both left scars. The silence stretched. Then, Dad quietly asked, "What do we do now?" That question hung in the room, heavy, because for once, nobody had a rescue plan. Nobody had a backup. Nobody had another loan. Nobody had another excuse. They were finally out of road. And somehow, all three of them were looking at me. The daughter they'd spent years overlooking. The daughter they never called unless something was wrong. The daughter who'd built a life without their help, waiting, hoping, expecting. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to save them. Nobody spoke. Not right away. Because everybody in that kitchen understood what was happening. For the first time in my life, the answer wasn't obvious. Usually, when there was a family crisis, everyone already knew how it ended. Emily messed up. Mom cried. Dad stressed. Somebody wrote a check. Problem solved. This time there was no check. And no bailout. No magic fix. Just consequences. And apparently they wanted me to be the solution. Again, I looked around the table. Mom, Dad, Emily, 3 pairs of eyes. Waiting, hoping, praying, and honestly, it pissed me off. Not because they needed help, because they expected it. Even now, even after everything, there was still this unspoken assumption that I'd figure something out, that I'd be responsible, that I'd carry the weight. Because that's what Hannah does. Right? Wrong? Finally, I broke the silence. How much do you need? Mom immediately looked relieved. Too relieved. That annoyed me. Dad named a number. I almost laughed. Again, I'd done a lot of laughing today. The kind that happens when reality gets ridiculous. The amount they needed was nearly everything Ryan and I had saved over 12 years. Everything. Our emergency fund. Investments. Future plans. Security. Gone. Just like that, for mistakes we didn't make. No, the word came out instantly. Mom froze. Dad stared. Emily looked away. No. Dad repeated. No silence. Then Mom started crying again. I know that sounds harsh, but at that point, I was emotionally exhausted. Everybody else had been crying all day. I was the one holding it together. As usual. Hannah, please. Mom's voice cracked. We could lose everything. I nodded. I know. We need help. I know. Another pause. Then Dad quietly asked, "So that's it?" I looked directly at him. No, the room tensed. Because they didn't understand. Not yet. I'm not giving you the money. Mom looked devastated. Dad looked angry. Emily looked ashamed. But I am willing to help. That got their attention. All three. Immediately. What does that mean? Dad asked. I took a deep breath. Because I already knew what came next, and they weren't going to like it. It means no more secrets. Nobody spoke. It means I see everything. Still silence. Every loan. Every debt. Every account. Every credit card. Every business record. Every tax document. Everything. The room went completely still. Dad shifted uncomfortably. That told me everything. There were more surprises. Of course there were. There are always more surprises. People don't end up millions of dollars in debt because they're honest about money. Everything. Dad asked carefully. I nodded. Everything. Mom looked nervous, very nervous. Emily looked like she wanted to disappear. Interesting. Very interesting. Because suddenly I had a feeling the situation was still getting worse. And I was right. 3 days later I met with their accountant, or former accountant, because he'd quit, which should have been a giant warning sign. The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. By the end of it, I wanted to walk into the ocean, fully clothed, and just keep walking. The house wasn't the biggest problem. Not even close. The business wasn't the biggest problem either. The IRS issue wasn't even in the top 3, which honestly felt impressive. In the worst possible way. The real problem was that Emily had been lying to everyone, including my parents. For years, the accountant slid a stack of papers toward me. I stared at them, then back at him, then at the papers again. These are real, he nodded. Unfortunately. My stomach dropped. Because according to those records, the business hadn't been profitable once. Not once. Not a single year. Not even during its so-called peak. Every social media post, every success story, every milestone, every celebration. Fake, or at least heavily exaggerated. The revenue existed. Sort of. The profits didn't. I rubbed my face hard, trying to make sense of it. So she knew. The accountant didn't hesitate. Yes. That answer hit me harder than I expected. Because until that moment, I'd been giving Emily some benefit of the doubt. Not much. But some. Maybe she'd been overwhelmed. Maybe she'd made mistakes. Maybe she'd been in denial. Nope. She knew. She knew for years. And she kept spending anyway. The anger came back instantly. Stronger this time. Hotter. Sharper. Because being reckless is one thing. Lying is another. I drove straight to Emily's apartment. Well, former apartment. She'd already moved back in with Mom and Dad, couldn't afford rent anymore. Another detail nobody had mentioned. Shocking. She opened the door. One look at my face and she knew. Oh. Yeah. Oh. I walked past her. Straight into the living room. Dropped the documents onto the coffee table. What is this? She looked down. Said nothing. What is this? Still nothing. I felt something inside me snap. Not dramatically. Not explosively. Quietly, like a rope finally giving out after years of strain. You lied. Emily stared at the floor. You lied to everybody. Nothing. You lied to Mom. Nothing. You lied to Dad. Nothing. Then I pointed at myself. And you lied to me. Finally she looked up, tears already forming. And honestly, I was too angry to care. Say something. She swallowed. I was scared. The answer made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because it was pathetic. You were scared? She nodded. I thought I could fix it. I stared at her. Then at the documents. Then back at her. You lost $2 million. Silence. You don't accidentally lose $2 million. More silence. You lose $2 million one bad decision at a time. That one hurt. I could see it. Good. It should. Then something happened that I wasn't expecting. Emily got angry. Actually angry. For the first time. You think I don't know that? Her voice cracked. I wake up every day knowing that. The room went silent. Tears streamed down her face. But she kept talking. I know I screwed up. More tears. I know I lied. More. I know everybody hates me. I opened my mouth. Then stopped. Because there was something different in her voice. Something I'd never heard before. No excuses. And no blame. And no performance. Just pain. Raw pain. You have no idea what it's like. She laughed bitterly. Do you know how many times I wanted to tell the truth? I didn't answer, because honestly, I didn't. She sank onto the couch, looking exhausted. Completely exhausted. I kept thinking next month would be better. Silence. Then it wasn't. Another pause. So I borrowed more. She wiped her eyes. Then I lied. More silence. Then I borrowed more. The cycle sounded familiar. Because that's exactly how people ruin their lives. Not all at once. A little at a time. One bad decision. Then another. Then another. Until eventually there's no way back. For the first time all day, I felt something besides anger. Fear. Because suddenly I realized something. This wasn't over. Not even close. The money problems were only the surface. Underneath all of it, something was seriously wrong with Emily, and unless we figured out what that was, no amount of money would ever be enough to save her. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ryan found me sitting in the kitchen at 2 a.m, bare feet, cold coffee, laptop open, spreadsheets everywhere. A completely normal Tuesday for a financial analyst having a nervous breakdown. He sat beside me, didn't say anything at first, just looked at the numbers, then looked at me. How bad? I laughed. That laugh again. The one I'd started using whenever reality became ridiculous. Very. Ryan nodded. I figured. For a while we sat in silence. Then he asked the question I'd been avoiding. What are you actually trying to save? I looked at him. The house. He shook his head. No, I frowned. What? The house isn't what you're trying to save. The certainty in his voice annoyed me. Mostly because I had a feeling he was right. Ryan pointed toward the spreadsheets. You're trying to save your parents. Silence. Then? Maybe. He nodded. And maybe you're trying to save Emily too. I didn't answer. Because that one hit a little too close to home. The truth was ugly. Part of me wanted to walk away. Completely. Let the consequences happen. Let everyone deal with the mess they created. Nobody had asked my opinion before driving off a cliff. Why was I responsible for pulling them back up? It wasn't a crazy argument. It was actually a pretty good one. The problem was, they were still my family. And family has a way of complicating otherwise logical decisions. 3 days later I got another surprise, because apparently the universe had decided I wasn't stressed enough. I was leaving work when an unfamiliar number called. Normally I ignore unknown calls. Something told me not to. I answered. Hello, a woman spoke. Is this Hannah Parker? Yes. A pause. Then. My name is Laura Benton. I had no idea who that was. Then she said 7 words that made my stomach drop. I used to work for Emily. Wonderful. Exactly what I needed. More bad news. We met the next morning. Laura looked exhausted. Not angry. Not bitter. Exhausted, the kind of tired that settles into someone's bones. She couldn't have been older than 27, maybe 28. And she looked like she'd aged 10 years. After 10 minutes of conversation, I understood why. Emily hadn't just lied to investors, or lenders, or family. She'd lied to employees too. I stared at Laura, trying to process what I was hearing. She missed payroll. Laura nodded. Twice. My stomach turned. Then what happened? Laura laughed, a humorless laugh, the usual. I already hated that answer. What does that mean? Promises. She looked out the window. Lots of promises. Apparently, Emily had convinced employees that new contracts were coming. New investors, new partnerships, new opportunities. Just hold on. Just wait. Just trust me. The problem? None of those things existed. By the time the company finally collapsed, people had gone months without being paid properly. Some lost savings, some accumulated debt. One employee lost her apartment, another moved back in with family. A third emptied retirement accounts trying to stay afloat. Every new detail felt like a punch to the chest, because this wasn't incompetence anymore. This was damage. Real damage. To real people. I drove straight to my parents' house. Again. At this point, I practically lived there. Emily was sitting on the back porch when I arrived, alone, wrapped in a blanket, staring into space. For a moment, she looked peaceful. Then she saw my face, and immediately knew. What now? Her voice sounded tired. Very tired. I didn't sit down. Laura Benton. Emily closed her eyes. That reaction told me everything. You remember her? Silence. Emily. She nodded. Barely. I felt anger building again. Fast, hot, dangerous. People trusted you. Nothing. You understand that, right? Nothing. Real people. Nothing. They weren't numbers. Still nothing. Then Emily surprised me. Again. She started crying. Not dramatic crying. Not loud crying. Just tears. Quiet tears. The kind people cry when they don't have energy left. I know. Her voice cracked. I know. More tears. I know. For some reason that made me even angrier. Maybe because she finally understood. Maybe because she understood too late. Do you? She nodded, then whispered. Every day. The words hung there. Heavy. Real. For the first time since this disaster started, I saw genuine guilt. Not fear. Not embarrassment. Not panic. Guilt. Actual guilt. And suddenly I remembered something. Emily had spent her entire life being rescued. Every mistake softened. Every consequence delayed. Every failure cushioned. Nobody had ever forced her to face reality. Not really. Now reality had arrived all at once, and she had absolutely no idea how to survive it. The thought should have made me feel satisfied. Instead, it made me sad. A week later, another bomb exploded. Because apparently we weren't done, not even close. I received an email from an attorney. Subject line. Notice of pending litigation. I opened it. Immediately regretted it. Several former employees were preparing a lawsuit. My stomach dropped. Hard. Because if they won, if even part of their claims were successful, the house wouldn't matter anymore. The debt wouldn't matter anymore. The business wouldn't matter anymore. Everything would get worse. Much worse. I sat in my office staring at the screen, reading the email again. Then one more time, hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves. They didn't. For several minutes I just sat there. Thinking. Calculating, trying to see a way out. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I couldn't find one. That terrified me. Because finding solutions is what I do. It's what I've always done. Give me enough information and enough time, and I'll figure something out. That's my thing. Always has been. But this wasn't a math problem anymore. It was people, secrets, pride, consequences, years of damage finally coming due. And as I stared at the lawsuit notice, one awful realization settled into my chest. The question was no longer whether Emily's life had collapsed. It had. The question was whether there would be anything left when the collapse finally stopped. I wish I could tell you the lawsuit was the thing that finally woke my parents up. It wasn't. Not completely. People don't change overnight, especially when they've spent decades convincing themselves they're doing the right thing, even when the evidence says otherwise. The lawsuit hit on a Thursday. By Saturday, Mom was already talking about refinancing again. I actually thought she was joking. She wasn't. We were sitting around their dining room table, the same table where every disaster in our family eventually ended up. Mom had a notebook. Dad had a calculator. I had a migraine. And Emily looked like she hadn't slept in days. What if we borrow against? No, I cut her off immediately. Mom blinked. I haven't finished. You don't need to. Silence. We are not borrowing more money. Dad sighed. Hannah. No, I pointed toward the stack of paperwork. That strategy is literally why we're here. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. Then something unexpected happened. Emily spoke first, and for the first time in my life, she agreed with me. No more loans. The room went silent. Mom looked shocked. Dad looked confused. I looked suspicious. Emily sat forward. No more. Her voice sounded firm, stronger than I'd heard in months. Nobody borrows anything. Mom stared at her. But sweetheart, no. Emily shook her head. I mean it. The room got very quiet. Because nobody was used to Emily saying no. Least of all Emily. I caused this. She swallowed hard. I'm not letting you lose more because of me. For a second, nobody knew how to respond, including me, because honestly, it was the first genuinely responsible thing I'd ever heard her say. Then Dad surprised everyone. He stood up, walked into the other room, and came back carrying a cardboard box. A small one, old, dusty, the kind people keep in closets for years. What is that? Mom looked confused. I was too. Dad set it on the table, slowly, carefully, then sat down. For a moment nobody spoke. Then he opened the box. Inside were folders, dozens of them, maybe more. My stomach tightened immediately, because something about Dad's expression felt different, heavy, ashamed, like he'd been carrying something for a long time. What is this? I asked. Dad looked directly at me. Not at Mom. Not at Emily. Me. Then he said 4 words. Words I'd never expected to hear. I owe you this. My pulse quickened. He pushed the box toward me. I opened the first folder, then froze. College documents, scholarship records, financial aid paperwork, acceptance letters. I frowned. What am I looking at? Dad swallowed. Hard. The truth. I didn't like the sound of that, not even a little. Then I opened another folder, and another, and another. The room slowly disappeared around me, because every folder contained pieces of my life, pieces I'd never seen before. Documents, applications, letters, emails, records, and suddenly, something didn't make sense. I grabbed one page, then another, then another. My heart started pounding. No, Dad closed his eyes. No, Mom looked confused now. Actually confused. Like she had no idea where this was going. I stared at the paperwork, unable to believe what I was seeing, because 20 years earlier, when I was applying to colleges, I had received acceptance letters from schools I never attended. That part wasn't surprising. I knew that. What was surprising was that there were schools I'd never even known accepted me, schools that had offered grants, scholarships, programs, opportunities. Elite schools. Big schools. Life-changing schools. My hands started shaking. What is this? Dad's voice cracked. I hid them. The room froze. Every sound disappeared. Every thought disappeared. I stared at him, certain I'd heard wrong. What? He couldn't look at me. I hid them. The words landed like a bomb. For a second I honestly couldn't breathe. What are you talking about? Dad looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, older too. You got into Stanford. Silence. My heart stopped. You got into Northwestern. Silence. You got into Georgetown. The room tilted. You had scholarships. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because nobody could. I stared at him, trying to process the sentence, trying to process the last 34 years, trying to process everything. And then I asked the only question that mattered. Why? Dad started crying, actually crying. Not quietly, not politely. Crying. Because he already knew there was no good answer. No explanation. No excuse. No justification. Only truth, and whatever truth was about to come out. I had a feeling it was going to change everything I thought I knew about my family. I don't remember standing up. 1 second I was sitting at the table. The next I was on my feet, the folder clenched in my hands, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. You hid them? My voice barely sounded like mine. Dad nodded. Once. Slowly, like the movement physically hurt. I laughed. A short, disbelieving laugh. Then another. Then suddenly I wasn't laughing anymore. You hid them, I repeated. Louder this time. Mom looked between us. Completely confused. What is she talking about? Dad didn't answer. David. Mom's voice sharpened. What is she talking about? He finally looked at her, and whatever she saw on his face made all the color drain from hers. Oh my God. Yeah, that was about right. I pulled another acceptance letter from the folder. Then another. Then another. Schools I'd dreamed about. Schools I'd researched. Schools I'd thought had rejected me. They hadn't. I stared at the documents. The dates. The signatures. The scholarship offers. Thousands. Tens of thousands. Some full rides. My entire future sitting in a cardboard box for 20 years. Why? Dad looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. Answer me. His voice cracked. We couldn't afford it. For a second I just stared at him, then I laughed again, because that answer was complete nonsense. That's a lie. He looked away. It's true. No, I held up a scholarship letter. A full scholarship means they pay. Silence. Another letter. They pay. Another. They pay. Another. They pay. Nobody spoke. Because everybody knew. The money wasn't the reason. I looked directly at him. Try again. The room went dead silent. Then Dad whispered, Emily needed us. I froze. No, no. No. My chest tightened. My stomach dropped. My entire body went cold. Because suddenly I understood. Not part of it. All of it. Every birthday. Every graduation. Every achievement. Every sacrifice. Every excuse. Everything. Dad rubbed his eyes. You would have left. The words landed harder than anything else. You would have gone away. Silence. And Emily. His voice broke completely. Emily couldn't function without us. The room exploded. Not literally. Emotionally. Mom stood up. What? She looked horrified. Actually horrified. What did you do? Dad buried his face in his hands. I thought I was protecting the family. The family? Mom shouted, the family? For the first time in my entire life. My mother was furious with my father. Not annoyed. Not frustrated. Furious. You sabotage her future. Dad cried harder. I know. You hid her acceptance letters. I know. You hid scholarships. I know. You made decisions about her life without telling her. I know. The shout echoed through the house. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that leaves bruises. I sat back down. Because suddenly I felt exhausted. Completely exhausted. Not angry anymore. Not even shocked. Just tired. So unbelievably tired. The worst part. I believed him. Not the excuse. The motive. I believed he truly thought he was helping. That's what made it so tragic. Because some of the deepest wounds don't come from cruelty. They come from love twisted into something unhealthy. Dad loved Emily so much he crippled her independence. And loved me so little or trusted me so much that he assumed I'd survive anything. Turns out both choices were disasters. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, Emily stood up, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Dad, then at me, then back at Dad. You did that because of me? Dad couldn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer sat on the table. In the folders. In the letters. In 20 years of consequences. Emily looked like she'd been punched. I never asked for that. Dad nodded. I know. You never told me. I know. You let me think I was the reason everybody stayed. That one hit hard. Because suddenly I realized something. Emily had been trapped too. Different cage. Same prison. She'd grown up believing she needed constant rescue. I'd grown up believing I didn't deserve help. Neither lesson was healthy. Neither lesson was true. And both came from the same place. Fear. Dad's fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of letting go. Fear of change. Fear disguised as love. Eventually Emily walked out, not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly, like somebody carrying too much weight. Mom followed a minute later, leaving Dad and me alone. The silence stretched. Then he said something I'll never forget. You should hate me. I looked at him. The man seemed older than ever, smaller too, like decades of mistakes had finally become visible. Maybe they had. I don't hate you. His eyes filled with tears. Really? I thought about it. Long and hard. Then nodded. No pause. But I don't trust you. That hurt him. I saw it happen. Good. Trust isn't supposed to be easy to lose or easy to get back. And for the first time in our lives, he wasn't being protected from consequences either. Neither of us spoke again for a while. Finally, I gathered the folders, stacked them neatly, closed the box, my entire lost future fitting inside cardboard. Strange. When I reached the door, Dad spoke again. Hannah. I turned. His voice shook. Did you ever wonder why I seemed more proud of Emily? The question caught me off guard. Because yeah. Of course I had. For years. Dad wiped his eyes, then whispered. I wasn't. Silence. I was worried about her. Another pause. I was proud of you. My throat tightened. More than you'll ever know. I didn't answer. Because some words arrive 20 years too late, even when they're true. And as I walked out of the house, carrying the box of letters that should have changed my life, I realized something. The financial disaster wasn't the biggest secret in our family. The lawsuit wasn't. The debt wasn't. The house wasn't. The biggest secret was that all of us had been living inside a story that wasn't true, and now that story was finally falling apart. The question was, what would be left when it did? The lawsuit ended up saving us. Not because we won, because we lost, at least partially, and losing forced everyone to stop lying. Finally, the former employees settled with Emily. Not for millions. There wasn't millions left, but enough to hurt, enough to matter, enough to make sure nobody could pretend the damage wasn't real. Emily spent 3 years paying people back. Every extra dollar she earned went toward it, every bonus, every tax refund, every side job gone. At first she hated it. Then something strange happened. She started sleeping again. Because for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't running. She was fixing. And apparently those are two very different things. The house survived too. Barely. Not because of me. That's important. For once, I wasn't the hero. I didn't write a giant check. I didn't rescue everyone. I didn't save the day. I simply refused to let them keep making stupid decisions. Turns out that helped more. My parents sold things. Lots of things. The boat Dad never used. The vacation property they'd bought during better years. Extra vehicles. Jewelry. Collections, all the little luxuries they'd convinced themselves they deserved. The process was brutal and necessary. Dad hated every second of it. At first. Then one evening he said something that surprised me. We were sitting on his back porch, the same place where he'd spent years planning how to save everyone else. He looked out at the yard and laughed. You know what? What? I don't miss any of it. I raised an eyebrow. The boat? No. The cabin? No. The toys? No. He shook his head. I thought those things meant I was successful. Silence. They were just things. For a man like my father, that realization was enormous. Mom changed too, honestly. Maybe more than anyone. For years she'd confused love with protection. If somebody cried, she fixed it. If somebody struggled, she stepped in. If somebody faced consequences, she softened them. Especially Emily. Always Emily. Now she stopped. Not because she stopped loving her, because she finally understood what the rescuing had done. One afternoon I overheard a conversation between them. Emily was frustrated, exhausted, ready to quit another job. The old version of Mom would have immediately started brainstorming solutions, making calls, pulling strings, writing checks. Instead, she smiled and said, "You'll figure it out." Emily stared at her. "What if I don't?" Mom shrugged. "Then you'll learn." I nearly fell out of my chair. Because 10 years earlier that conversation would have been impossible. The biggest surprise, though, was Emily. Not because she became wildly successful. She didn't. Not because she became rich. She didn't. Not because she suddenly transformed into some perfect person. Nobody does. The surprise was that she became normal. And honestly, that was harder. There are no applause breaks in normal life. No dramatic announcements. No giant successes. No audience. No spotlight. Just work. Bills. Responsibilities. Relationships. Routine. The stuff she'd spent years avoiding. The stuff I'd spent years doing. Turns out it wasn't beneath her after all. She'd simply never learned how. 3 years after the collapse, Emily got a management position at a regional marketing company. Not glamorous, not flashy, just solid, reliable, real. The first thing she did with her first big bonus was unexpected. She paid off a former employee she'd still owed money to, personally, without being asked, without posting about it online, without telling anyone. I only found out months later. That meant more to me than any apology ever could. As for me, life kept moving. Ryan and I had our first child, a daughter. Then 2 years later, a son. My parents became grandparents, and watching them with my kids was strange. Really strange, because for the first time, I saw them trying, actually trying. Not being perfect, just trying. Dad never missed a birthday. Not one. Mom showed up to every recital, every soccer game, every school event. Sometimes I wondered if they were making up for lost time. Maybe they were. I didn't stop them. One afternoon, when my daughter was 7, she asked me a question. A simple question. One kids ask all the time. "Mom?" "Yeah." "Who's your favorite?" I laughed. "Favorite what?" "Child." I almost answered automatically, then stopped, because suddenly I was 8 years old again, standing in my parents' kitchen, watching a pattern form that would shape my entire life. I pulled her onto my lap. That's easy. She smiled. What? There isn't one. She frowned. Really? Really? What if one is better? I smiled. What if they're different? She thought about that, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for. The box stayed in my closet for years. The box with the acceptance letters, the scholarships, the life I almost had. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Couldn't bring myself to look at it either. So it sat there, waiting. 5 years after the disaster, Dad asked about it. We were cleaning out my garage. The subject came up. He looked nervous. Very nervous. Do you still have it? I nodded. Silence. Then, why? I thought about that longer than he probably expected. Then I gave him the truth. Because it's part of my story. He looked down, ashamed. But it's not my future. That got his attention. I smiled. A real smile. I like my life. And I meant it. Would Stanford have been amazing? Sure. Would Georgetown have changed things? Maybe. Would Northwestern have opened doors? Absolutely. But here's the thing. Nobody gets the life they imagined at 18. Nobody. Not really. Life happens. People happen. Mistakes happen. Detours happen. Sometimes terrible things happen. Sometimes beautiful things happen. Usually both. And somehow, through all of it, we become who we become. Dad cried a little after that. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way older men cry when they finally allow themselves to, before he left that day. He stopped beside his truck, then looked back at me. I spent years thinking I was protecting this family. I waited. I was actually controlling it. The honesty surprised me, even. Then he smiled. A tired smile. But a real one. And somehow you turned out okay anyway. I laughed anyway. He laughed too. Then he drove away. The funny thing about family is that people always expect a clean ending. A perfect ending. A movie ending where everybody hugs, everybody forgives, everybody learns, everybody lives happily ever after. That's not what happened. There are still awkward holidays, still uncomfortable conversations, still scars, still regrets. Some things never disappear completely, but that's okay, because healing isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending. It isn't rewriting history. It's remembering what happened and choosing what happens next. My parents gave my sister everything. For years, I thought that meant they loved her more. Maybe part of me always would. But now, 5 years later, I think the truth was simpler and sadder. They were afraid she'd fall. So they never let her stand. And they thought I was strong enough to survive anything. So they stopped checking if I needed help. Both mistakes came from love. Misguided love, damaging love. But love all the same. The house still stands. The family still exists. The debt is gone. The lies are gone. The rescuing is gone. And for the first time in a very long time. So are the secrets.